The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the London family court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air felt heavy with tension as people filled the seats, their quiet conversations creating a soft murmur that echoed off the high ceiling. This was not just any ordinary day in court. This was a day that would change lives forever. Rebecca Williams sat in the front row, her posture perfect and her confidence radiating through the room. She was a woman who had never known struggle, never faced real hardship. Her expensive handbag rested beside her on the leather seat, and her diamond earrings caught the light as she turned her head to speak with her lawyer. She had paid top dollar for the best legal representation money could buy, and it showed. Her lawyer, dressed in an immaculate suit that cost more than most people and in a month, shuffled through papers with the calm efficiency of someone who rarely lost a case. Rebecca's blonde hair was styled to perfection, not a single strand out of place. Her navy blue dress was tailored to fit her perfectly, and her makeup was applied with the skill of a professional artist. She looked like success, like privilege, like someone who always got what she wanted. And today, she wanted to keep her adopted daughter, Emma, safely in her custody. On the other side of the courtroom sat a very different figure. James Thompson was barely 21 years old, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had experienced more hardship than most people twice. His age, his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. The tie was simple, nothing fancy, but it was clean and pressed. He had bought it specifically for this day, along with the dark suit that was his only good outfit. James had worked extra shifts at both of his jobs to save money for this court appearance. He cleaned office buildings at night, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while the city slept. During the day, he stocked shelves at a local grocery store, carefully arranging products and helping customers find what they needed. Every penny he earned went toward two things: preparing for this day and creating a home for the daughter he had never stopped loving. His court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Davies, was a kind man with graying hair and tired eyes. He had handled hundreds of cases like this one, and he knew the odds were stacked against his young client. But there was something about James that made him want to fight harder than usual. Maybe it was the way James spoke about his daughter with such pure love, or maybe it was the determination that never seemed to fade from his eyes, no matter how many obstacles he faced. The courtroom began to quiet as Justice Margaret Foster entered. She was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a reputation for fairness. She had seen every kind of case during her years on the bench, and she prided herself on looking beyond appearances to find the truth. Her black robes rustled as she took her place at the front of the room, and everyone rose to show respect. Justice Foster called the session to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades ensuring justice was served. She looked out at the packed courtroom, and then down at the papers in front of her. This was a custody case, she announced, and Mr. Thompson was petitioning for custody rights. The moment those words left her lips, Rebecca Williams could not contain herself. A small laugh escaped her throat, and she turned to her lawyer with an expression of disbelief. Her voice was not as quiet as she thought when she whispered, "This is ridiculous. Look at him. What could he possibly offer a child that I cannot?" Her words carried across the silent courtroom like a stone thrown into still water. The arrogance in her tone was unmistakable. This was a woman who had never been told no, who had never faced real consequences for her actions. She believed that money and status were all that mattered, and she could not understand how anyone could challenge her right to keep Emma. James felt every eye in the room turn toward him. His cheeks burned with embarrassment, but beneath that shame was something stronger: love for his daughter and determination to fight for her. He had dreamed of this moment for 3 long years. Ever since he had learned the truth about what had happened to his child, every night when he finished his cleaning job, every morning when he stocked shelves, he thought about Emma and promised himself he would never give up. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin. Yes, he was young. Yes, he was poor. Yes, he did not have fancy clothes or expensive lawyers, but he had something Rebecca Williams could never buy: the pure, unconditional love of a father for his child. Today, he would fight for that love, no matter what anyone thought of him. The battle was about to begin, and James Thompson was ready to face whatever came next. The moment arrived when James Thompson was called to stand and speak. His legs felt weak as he rose from his chair, but he forced himself to walk steadily to the front of the courtroom. Every step echoed in the silence, and he could feel dozens of eyes watching his every movement. His heart hammered against his chest, but he had practiced these words 1,000 times in his small apartment. James cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was quiet at first, barely above a whisper, but it carried a strength that surprised even him. Your Honor, I work 2 jobs to support myself, every night after most people go to sleep. I clean offices in the city center. I mop floors, empty trash bins, and make sure everything is spotless for the next day. When the sun comes up, I go to my second job at the grocery store, where I stock shelves and help customers. He paused, gathering courage to continue. The words he had rehearsed so many times suddenly felt more real, more important than ever before. It's not much, Your Honor. I know that. But I've been saving every single penny I earn to create a home. For Emma, a real home where she can feel safe and loved. James's voice grew stronger as he spoke about the small apartment he had prepared with such care. I found a little place not far from a good school. It's just 2 rooms. But I painted the walls yellow because I thought it would make her happy. I bought a bed and covered it with pink sheets because I remembered how much she loved pink when she was little. I spent weeks looking for the perfect toys, nothing too expensive, but things that would make her smile. The young man's eyes grew distant as he remembered all the nights he had spent in that apartment, imagining his daughter there with him. I may not have much money, Your Honor, but I have something more important. I have so much love to give her. Emma has been in my heart every single day for 3 years. Not one morning has passed when I haven't thought about her first thing when I wake up. Not one night has ended without me wondering if she's safe and happy. As James spoke these heartfelt words, something incredible happened in the courtroom. Several people in the audience began to lean forward, drawn in by the raw emotion in his voice. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine, touched by the young father's sincere testimony. But not everyone was moved by his words. Rebecca Williams sat in her expensive seat, and as James continued to speak, her face began to change. What started as mild annoyance grew into something much uglier. She watched this young man pour his heart out, and instead of feeling any sympathy, she felt only disdain. How dare he think he could provide for a child when he could barely provide for himself? When James finished speaking and returned to his seat, Rebecca could not control herself any longer. A laugh bubbled up from her throat, sharp and cutting in the quiet courtroom. She quickly covered her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand, but the damage was already done. The sound echoed off the walls like a slap in the face. Rebecca turned to her expensive lawyer, speaking in a voice that was meant to be a whisper but carried clearly across the room. Your Honor, surely we're not seriously considering this situation. She gestured toward James with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if he were nothing more than an annoying insect. Her voice grew louder and more confident as she continued. I can provide private schools wherever. We'll get the best education money can buy. I can take her on vacations to places she's only dreamed of seeing. I can give her everything a child needs. Designer clothes, music lessons, art classes. Whatever her heart desires. She paused dramatically, then delivered what she thought was the final blow. What can he possibly offer her? A life of poverty, a future of struggle. Rebecca's lawyer, a seasoned professional who had seen many cases go wrong, began to tug frantically at her sleeve. He could see the judge's expression changing, and he knew his client was making a terrible mistake. But Rebecca felt completely untouchable. She had money, she had connections, and she had influence. In her mind, this case was already decided in her favor. James felt tears sting his eyes as Rebecca's cruel words hit him like physical blows. He had faced this kind of treatment before in his young life. People who looked at his skin color, his simple clothes, his lack of money, and decided he was worth nothing. But never before had the stakes been so high. This was about his daughter, the most important person in his world. He blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. He would not give Rebecca Williams the satisfaction of seeing him cry. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside himself. Justice Foster watched this entire display with growing anger. Her expression hardened as she observed Rebecca's behavior. The judge had seen arrogance before, but this level of disrespect was something else entirely. Mrs. Williams, Justice Foster said in a stern voice that cut through the courtroom like a blade, "You will respect the dignity of this court and all who appear before it." But Rebecca just smiled smugly, completely confident that her wealth would win the day. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point as Justice Foster shuffled through the papers on her desk. The room had become so quiet that even the smallest sound seemed amplified. People held their breath, waiting for what would come. Next, the judge's face was serious as she looked up from the documents. "I will now call for the DNA evidence to be presented," Justice Foster announced in her clear, authoritative voice. The words sent a ripple of movement through the courtroom as everyone shifted in their seats, trying to get a better view of what was happening. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, stood up from her desk at the side of the room. She walked carefully to the judge's bench, carrying a manila folder that seemed to hold the weight of the world. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she approached Justice Foster and handed over the official documents. Justice Foster opened the folder with deliberate care. Her eyes scanned the pages, reading every word twice to make sure she understood exactly what she was seeing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Rebecca Williams drummed her manicured fingers on the arm of her chair, still confident that everything would work out in her favor. James Thompson sat frozen in his seat, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white. His entire future hung on whatever those papers contained. He had hoped and prayed for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt terrified of what the truth might reveal. Finally, Justice Foster looked up from the documents. Her expression was unreadable as she cleared her throat to speak. The entire courtroom leaned forward, waiting for her words. "The DNA results confirm," the judge announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "that Mr. James Thompson is the biological father of Emma Thompson." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Rebecca Williams' confident smile vanished from her face as if someone had wiped it away with a cloth. Her skin went from its healthy pink glow to a sickly pale white in the span of seconds. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out at first. "That's impossible," Rebecca finally whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to look at her expensive lawyer, searching his face for some sign that this was all a mistake. that somehow the tests were wrong, but her lawyer's expression showed only shock and growing concern. Justice Foster was not finished. She continued reading from the thick file in front of her voice growing colder with each word. It appears that Emma was removed from Mr. Thompson's care when he was 18 years old, during what the records describe as a difficult period in his life. The adoption was processed while he was unaware of his parental rights. The judge paused, letting the weight of these words settle over the courtroom. She looked directly at Rebecca Williams, whose face was now completely drained of color. The records show that Mr. Thompson was never properly notified of the adoption proceedings, which is a serious violation of legal protocol. James Thompson felt his world collapse and rebuild itself in the same moment. 3 years of searching, 3 years of wondering, 3 years of working 2 jobs and saving every penny. It all suddenly made sense. The little girl he had been fighting for was not just someone he loved. She was his own flesh and blood. He broke down completely, his shoulders shaking with 3 years of suppressed emotion. Tears streamed down his face as he covered his eyes with his hands. All this time, he had been searching for his daughter, working to become the man she deserved as a father. Every night when he cleaned those empty offices, every day when he stocked those shelves, he had been driven by love for a child who was truly his. The truth began to unfold like a terrible storm, and everyone in the courtroom could feel its power. Justice Foster continued reading from the documents, her voice growing more serious with each revelation. The papers told a story of manipulation and deception that shocked even the experienced court officials. Rebecca Williams had used her wealth and connections to fast-track the adoption process. She had known from the beginning that James was Emma's biological father, but she had deliberately kept this information hidden. She understood that a young black father with no money and no influence would never be able to fight the system she had so carefully manipulated. The records showed that Rebecca had told Emma lies about her birth parents. She had convinced the little girl that her real parents did not want her, that they had abandoned her without a second thought. This cruel deception had shaped Emma's understanding of herself and her place in the world. I didn't know," Rebecca stammered, but her words rang hollow in the silent courtroom. Her lawyer's horrified expression suggested that he was beginning to understand the full scope of what his client had done. His face showed the look of a man who realized he had been defending someone whose actions were far worse than he had imagined. Justice Foster's voice became ice cold as she continued reviewing the documents. Each page revealed another layer of Rebecca's deception, another way she had manipulated the system to get what she wanted. The comfortable world Rebecca had built on lies and manipulation was crumbling before everyone's eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The courtroom atmosphere grew even more tense as Justice Foster called for additional witnesses to come forward. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room opened with a soft creak, and a woman in a dark blue uniform entered. She walked with the confident stride of someone who had seen many difficult cases and was not easily shaken by what she discovered. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was a seasoned officer from the Family Crimes Unit, his special division that dealt with cases involving children and family disputes. Her graying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from years of investigating the darkest corners of human behavior. She carried a thick folder under her arm, filled with documents that would change everything. As Detective Collins took her place at the witness stand, she looked directly at Rebecca Williams with the steady gaze of someone who had been watching her for a very long time. The detective's voice was calm and professional as she began to speak, but her words carried a weight that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. "Mrs. Williams has been under investigation by our unit for the past 8 months," Detective Collins announced. Her statement sent a shock wave through the room. Rebecca's face went even paler, if that was possible, and she gripped the arms of her chair with white knuckles. The detective opened her folder and began to read from her notes. Our investigation has revealed that Mrs. Williams used her considerable wealth and social connections to manipulate the adoption system in ways that violated both the law and basic human decency. She specifically targeted single fathers from disadvantaged backgrounds, knowing they lacked the financial resources and legal knowledge to fight back against her actions. James Thompson felt his heart sink as he realized he was not alone in his suffering. There were others who had experienced the same heartbreak, the same loss, the same desperate search for their children. He was not Rebecca's first victim, just one of many whose lives she had destroyed for her own selfish purposes. Detective Collins continued with her testimony, her voice growing more serious with each revelation. We have documented evidence of at least 3 other families that have been torn apart by Mrs. Williams' actions. In each case, she followed the same pattern of behavior. The detective explained how Rebecca had used her money and influence to convince social workers to remove children from loving homes. She would identify vulnerable families, usually single fathers who were struggling financially but who loved their children deeply. Then she would use her connections to create false reports and manipulate the system until these children were taken away from their real parents. After the children were removed from their homes, Detective Collins continued, Mrs. Williams would then swoop in to adopt them herself. She presented herself as a caring, wealthy woman who could provide these children with opportunities their birth parents never could. But what she was really doing was stealing families and destroying lives. Rebecca's expensive lawyer began to shift uncomfortably in his seat. He had been paid a fortune to represent her. But as he listened to the detective's testimony, he realized that his client had lied to him about everything. He began gathering his papers, clearly preparing to distance himself from the case before it damaged his own reputation. Your Honor, the lawyer said nervously, his voice shaking slightly, I want to make it clear that I was completely unaware of these allegations. My client led me to believe this was a simple custody dispute. Rebecca's hands began to tremble as she realized the full scope of what was happening round her. This was no longer just about keeping Emma in her custody. The detective's testimony had revealed a pattern of criminal behavior that could send her to prison for years. Her privileged life, built on lies and manipulation, was falling apart in front of everyone, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In a desperate attempt to defend herself, Rebecca stood up from her chair, her voice rising with panic. I gave her a good life, she said, her words tumbling over each other. I loved her. I provided for her. Emma has had everything she could ever want. The best schools, beautiful clothes, trips to amazing places. I took care of her when no one else would. The courtroom fell silent as Rebecca's words echoed off the walls. But Justice Foster's expression showed no mercy, no sympathy for the woman who had caused so much pain to so many families. The judge had seen enough evidence to understand exactly what kind of person Rebecca Williams really was. Mrs. Williams, Justice Foster said in a voice that was colder than winter ice, you built your family on the destroyed hopes of others. You stole children from parents who loved them and then convinced yourself that you were doing something good. That is not love. That is theft of the most cruel and heartless kind. The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. She had spent years telling herself that she was a good mother, that she had saved Emma from a life of poverty and struggle. But now, faced with the truth of her actions, she could no longer hide behind her lies. The woman who had laughed at a young father's pain, who had mocked his poverty and dismissed his love for his daughter, now sat in stunned silence. She watched her carefully constructed world collapse round her, and for the first time in her privileged life, she faced the consequences of her actions. The moment of truth had arrived. Justice Foster sat straight in her chair, her hands folded on the desk before her. The entire courtroom held its breath as she prepared to deliver the verdict that would change. Multiple lives forever, her voice carried the weight of years of experience and the power of true justice as she began to speak. After reviewing all the evidence presented in this case, Justice Foster said, her words echoing clearly through the silent room, I hereby grant full custody of Emma Thompson to her biological father, James Thompson. James felt his heart explode with joy. 3 years of searching, 3 years of working to jobs, 3 years of never giving up hope had finally led to this moment. Tears streamed down his face, but these were tears of happiness, not sorrow. His hands shook as he covered his face, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions washing over him. But Justice Foster was not finished. Her expression grew stern as she continued speaking, her voice taking on a tone that promised serious consequences. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate arrest of Rebecca Williams for fraud, bribery, and child trafficking. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had been so confident, so sure that her wealth and connections would protect her. Now she sat frozen in her chair, unable to process what was happening. Her comfortable world of privilege and control was crashing down round her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. 2 police officers who had been waiting outside the courtroom entered through the heavy wooden doors. Police Constable Michael Roberts, a tall man with kind eyes but a firm demeanor, approached Rebecca's seat. His partner followed closely behind, carrying the handcuffs that would symbolize the end of Rebecca's reign of manipulation. Mrs. Williams, Constable Roberts said in a professional voice, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Rebecca's expensive lawyer had already gathered his papers and stepped away from her, clearly wanting to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. She looked round the courtroom desperately, searching for someone who might help her, but found only faces filled with disgust and disappointment. The metallic click of handcuffs closing round Rebecca's wrists seemed to echo through the entire room. As Constable Roberts led her toward the door, she turned back to look at James one final time. Her face showed shock and complete defeat. The woman who had mocked him for his poverty, who had laughed at his simple clothes and humble background, now faced years in prison while he prepared to be reunited with his daughter. Her laughter had been replaced by tears, her arrogance by despair. As the police officers led her away, Rebecca finally understood the devastating consequences of her actions. She had destroyed families, stolen children, and manipulated the system for her own selfish desires. Now she would pay the price for her crimes. James walked out of the courthouse on shaking legs, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and nervousness. The late afternoon sun felt warm on his face, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt hope flooding through his entire body. Outside the building, he saw a social worker standing with a small girl who had been waiting patiently. Emma was 7 years old now, no longer the toddler he remembered from their last meeting. She had grown taller, her hair was longer, and her face showed the intelligence and curiosity of a child who had been asking questions about her past. Her bright eyes sparkled with the same warmth James remembered, and when she looked at him, he saw traces of his own gentle smile reflected in her features. The social worker, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, gently nudged Emma forward. "Emma, this is your father," she said softly. "He's been looking for you for a very long time." James knelt down to Emma's level, his heart racing as he looked into the face of the daughter he had never stopped loving. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "Hello, Emma. I'm your daddy, and I've been looking for you for so long." Emma studied his face carefully, her young mind processing something that felt familiar but distant. Slowly, a look of recognition began to dawn in her eyes. She had always felt like something was missing from her life. Even when Rebecca had given her everything money could buy. "I dreamed about you," Emma whispered, her small voice filled with wonder. "I dreamed about someone who would love me just for being me." James felt tears well up in his eyes again as he reached out to gently touch his daughter's hand. "I have loved you every single day since the moment you were born," he said. "And I will love you every day for the rest of my life." Emma stepped closer to her father. James carefully wrapped her in a hug that felt like coming home. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other while the world continued to move around them as they walked away from the courthouse together, hand in hand. James felt his heart fill with a joy he had never experienced before. The young man who had been mocked for his poverty had won something far more valuable than money. He had won back his daughter's love, and together they would build a new life filled with the kind of happiness that no amount of wealth could ever buy. The story of their reunion spread through the community like wildfire, reminding everyone that truth and justice will always triumph over prejudice and corruption. The parents' love truly knows no boundaries of race or class. And sometimes the most powerful victories come from the most humble hearts.